Welcome back to another edition of the Fantasy Slant powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings.com. I'm your host, Jeff Ratcliffe. And boy, oh boy, things are starting to heat up. So we're going to dive right into the talk for today. With me, as always, Mike Clay. Mike, some big stuff. The proverbial hit the fan in New England with Tom Brady getting suspended for 4 games over this deflate gate. We mentioned the Ted Wells report in last week's show. Well, it all came to fruition here. 4 games, a pretty harsh penalty, but we're not here to discuss, whether or not this is merited. What we want to do is assess this for fantasy football purposes. So, Mike, tell me what your thoughts are. Generally speaking, what does this do to Brady, more specifically in fantasy, for fantasy purposes, in the wake of the suspension?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't want to be too redundant. I mean, we talked about this a little last week. I mean, I think many of us agree, at least at the top of the quarterback position, you have Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck. Whether I think most people prefer Rodgers, we do as well at PFF. But either way, that's your first tier quarterback. The next tier, and this is where there's some debate, but as far as I'm concerned, there was a tier of 4: Breeze, Wilson, Manning, Brady. I think that with Brady suspended 4 games, if that does hold up, I think he falls out of that tier. Best case scenario, he's at the bottom of it. But with the depth at the position, with Newton in there, Romo, Roethlisberger, even Tannehill, who's nothing to get overly excited about, but a back end quarterback one, and then Phillip Rivers. You have an emerging guy like Teddy Bridgewater, of course, Colin Kaepernick, Eli Manning, Matthew Stafford, Bradford. That whole group there. If you take 4 games away from Brady at him replacement level, he's still probably a backup quarterback one. But there's so many guys that are in that range that it's almost not worth reaching on him and stashing for 4 weeks. I mean, how many times do we tell people not to, necessarily draft a backup quarterback, especially if you have a decent option? Why hold him and a guy like Matt Ryan or Big Ben, for 4 weeks? Those guys are available late. Brady is probably going to cost you a pick in that. I'm going to guess 8 to 10 range. We'll kind of see how that shakes out. But, I'm not overly excited. But, if people are just ignoring him, there might be some value to be had there, especially if you have deeper benches. But, I'm certainly not overly excited about him right now. I think the thing we probably should focus on is the 4-week impact on everyone else, though.
Yeah, you're right. But before we do get into that, I just want to give my thought process on all of this. When we talk about 4 games, okay, in the grand scheme of the NFL season, yes, it's a quarter of the season. But that's not a quarter of the regular season for fantasy football. It's really a third of the season, which is pretty significant when you think about it. We were talking about last week, we're saying carry depth at wide receiver, carry depth at running back. You can get away with not having a backup tight end, a backup quarterback. Well, if you draft Brady, you're going to have a backup quarterback for 4 weeks. That's prime real estate when players break out every season. We see players break out in the first couple weeks of the year. You want that room on your bench to potentially get one of these guys because this is the make or break type moves that really win fantasy seasons. So, for me, I'm going to avoid Brady at all costs. If the suspension does hold up for 4 games now, if it gets reduced to 2, maybe 1, or hey, apparently he's hiring the legal team of the century, so maybe it gets completely eliminated. But for now, if it stands at 4, I can't draft this guy. For me, he's undraftable. I'm going elsewhere, Mike. Some of the players you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, we're usually pushing weighting at the position. So I mean, if it is a league with deeper benches, and he is falling. He's, again, if you have that bench space, it's not a bad idea to stash him there. If you're streaming anyway, then you get yourself a strong quarterback from down the stretch. But you also have to keep in mind, we're higher on him, at least prior to the suspension, we were higher on him as our most than he finished last year. I mean, he was, I think, quarterback 9 in most formats. I think Ryan Tannehill was 1 spot ahead of him. So really you could justify saying, okay, I think he's going to have a similar season. And he's out 4 games. Why would I take him over Ryan Tannehill? You can make that argument. That's probably his floor is right around that quarterback 12 area, 10 to 12 area. If you look at his whole season, including the playoffs, he was very good to finish the year. So there is, optimism. He can be a top 5 quarterback when he's playing, but there's also the fact that he was barely a top 10 fantasy quarterback last year. So it is a tough balancing act. It always is with considering replacement value. We have the same issue with Le'Veon Bell, of course, and we dealt with that last year when wondering if Rob Gronkowski would start the season. Odell Beckham, same kind of thing. So It's a tricky balancing act, but I think his status really depends on your league structure.
Yeah, and he didn't top 2 touchdown passes from week 11 on. So down the stretch, it wasn't like he was a monster. I mean, he was starting caliber, but he wasn't a beast by any means. It's not the Tom Brady that we'll always have 2007 in our minds, but it wasn't that Tom Brady for sure.
It wasn't the playoffs though. It wasn't the playoffs, and that's what he really finished strong last year against some tough opponents in the playoffs, and that's what I think really allowed people to say, okay, well, he's not number 9, even though he finished the regular season slowly. He started it slowly too. But he finished up. He was just so dominant in the playoffs. It really makes him look like he can't be that mid-pack quarterback one.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to get everybody excited for the opening of the season, we're going to have Jimmy Garoppolo handing the ball to, I don't even know it, running back Jonas Gray. And D'Angelo Williams getting maybe 20 touches for the Steelers. So get excited, everybody. But Mike, you brought up the impact here. And I think the player that everybody is thinking about the most right off the bat is Rob Gronkowski. So, is there a ripple effect here for Gronkowski for you, or is this just doesn't move the needle whatsoever?
Well, I mean, I still have him 44 points ahead of the number 2 tight end, Jimmy Graham. So, it doesn't change a lot. I think he definitely came down a little bit. I mean, you look at the touchdown department. New England last year was very good. They averaged, let's see here. I have to make sure I get it exactly right. 3.3 touchdowns per game. You look back to, 2010, 2011, 12, they were in that 3.4 to 3.6 range. They were a little below that. You remember they started slowly last year. After that, they were right in that zone where they've been for years. So they are a top scoring offense. You figure you take Brady out of that, you put Garoppolo in, you have to anticipate a drop off. I'm going to say maybe 60, 70% of what you normally expect from this offense. I think they'll be right around league average in touchdown production the first 4 weeks. That being said, they're not going to be bad. And Gronk is a very good player, and he's heavily targeted. I think he's going to be okay. I think he'll still be the number 1 fantasy tight end when we're ranking for week 1 comes early September. And I think that'll be the case throughout the early portion of the season and obviously the rest of the way. So is he still a first-round pick? I think there's enough high-end talent that you don't have to take that chance since he's going to miss since Brady's out the first 4 weeks. I think he's probably best viewed as like at the turn or early in round 2. I think I'd rather go with a guy like Odell Beckham or top-end wide receivers in that category right now rather than go Gronk in the first round. But before the suspension, I think Gronk was a decent pick in late round 1.
So you're not worried about the Madden curse?
You mean the injury rate regression curse?
Yeah, that's all. I'm not a big superstitious person whatsoever, so I'm not really buying into anything linked up there. A lot of the times it was guys later in their career, or older players, I should say, later in their career. And you're exactly right; those injuries are just going to happen. Well,
let me touch on that. I mean, it can't hurt to mention this quickly. What that is. I mean, think about what it takes to get on the Madden cover. Who was on the Madden cover coming off a down season? That's almost never the case. It's somebody who had everything go right. They stayed healthy for 16 games. They had a good situation where they were just getting a ton of touches, 300 carries, whatever it is. Everything went right for them to get that all-pro status, make the Pro Bowl, get an award, and get that hype to end up on the Madden cover, because it used to not be a fan vote. It used to just be, one of the top players ended up on the cover. So in the NFL, I mean, think about shelf lives, think about injury rates. How often does a player play 16 games back-to-back years? How often does everything go right back-to-back seasons? It's just almost impossible. So it's not a Madden curse. It's never been a Madden curse. It's just guys can't hold up for 32 consecutive games to play at a high level. At least it's very rare. So anyway, that's my ramble about the ridiculous concept of the Madden curse. But all right, back to fantasy.
So, and all valid points, and it shows like that this stuff, we can look at this in an analytic sense. I know sometimes people want to put this whole mystical spin on the analysis of football, but ultimately, when you look at the numbers, there is a lot of validity there. But let's go back to the depth chart here in New England, just sort of wrapping things up with this impact of Tom Brady's suspension. All right, so we have our top receiving targets here at wide receiver are going to be both Julian Edelman and Brandon LaFell. Mike, I know you're probably higher on LaFell than maybe the consensus in the industry. But, looking at these two players, obviously Edelman, very volume dependent, not going to have a high average depth of target, whereas LaFell maybe the other way around. But what is your expectation for the impact on these guys with Garoppolo at quarterback?
Well, I mean, first Edelman, I mean, most people agree he's a mid-pack wide receiver, too. That's where we have him ranked, probably more like a borderline wide receiver one in PPR. I think this knocks him down a little bit. I mean, you look at he's kind of a boring pick. You know what you're going to get. He's going to get he's going to rack up a lot of receptions. He's going to do a lot of underneath work. He did get some more work near the goal line than I think people realized last year. But really, that's not a player of his stature is not going to be a huge asset near the goal line. I think this knocks him down a few spots just because that tier where he's near the top of, it's pretty deep. I mean, you start getting into Keenan Allen, Vincent Jackson, Jordan Matthews, Cooper, Kevin White, Watkins, Marshall, those kind of guys. You could kind of knock him down in that territory, I think, with 4 games with a pedestrian, maybe a worse than that quarterback. We don't really know what to expect there. As for LaFell, I definitely think he's underrated. I mean, he was a borderline wide receiver 2 last year, and pretty much nothing has changed. If anything, he's going to start for 16 games instead of, play a significant role for 13 or 14 like he did last year. So, I still have him in that 26 range. I think he'll start slowly, but, where he's being drafted, he's not a starter. You know what I mean? You're not taking him in the draft and saying, okay, that's my number 2 receiver. That's my number 3 receiver most of the time. Usually, if you're drafting well, you get him as your 4 or 5. So he's on your bench anyway. It's just a value pick where he's going to, at least after week 4, certainly after week 4, he's going to provide you wide receiver 2 numbers, and you got him, as your 4 or 5. So it's not a big deal if you still take him at his what his ADP was. I think it's around 7 or 8. I think he's going around 8 right now. And just throw him on your bench for a few weeks. It works the same way, and you'll end up happy once Mr. Brady comes back.
Absolutely. Can't preach this enough. Depth at wide receiver, depth at running back. And to relate to what we were talking about, the Madden cover, injuries are going to happen. They're almost unavoidable. Like you should, if you escape a fantasy season without losing a single player, you should feel really lucky, right? It's just going to happen. So having that depth at the position not only helps you through the bye weeks, it helps you with these injury situations. And a guy like LaFell really does stand out. You're always searching for those value picks, and he's a guy certainly that you can get a good return on investment with. So, Mike, any other thoughts about New England, this whole situation, or do you want to jump into the discussion for today?
No, I don't think so. I think, just a kind of a general thought, watching their running back situation shake out is going to be interesting. I mean, right now you look at, we have James White ranked ahead of Travaris Cadet. Up at ESPN last week, there was a lot of talk about how Cadet seems to be, a favorite of that coaching staff, and there's a good chance he wins that job too. It really depends what they think of White. He was a 4th-round pick by this regime last year, but whoever wins that battle is going to be on the PPR radar and could essentially steal Shane Vereen's role exactly. I mean, even when starters were out, Vereen's role usually didn't increase when they had a week to game plan. He just played the same role. So this is a guy that, one of these guys could settle into that role and end up, in being a flex in PPR, and they're basically free in drafts right now. And then on early downs, Blunt's out week 1. We'll see if Jonas Gray could have a big game and kind of steal some of Blunt's thunder. I think Blunt should be a running back 2 in standard as long as he takes on that 12 to 15 carry role and gets the goal line work. I think he has just under 300 carries as a New England Patriot in his career and has 17 touchdowns. So over a full season, you figure if he gets 220 carries, he may score 10 times. It's not crazy in this offense. And then, of course, Brandon Bolden, who's always going to be a special teamer, situational guy, and Tyler Gaffney, Dion Lewis. So there's a lot of bodies there. But 3 of them will probably play a semi to, largely significant role this season. And I don't know who it's going to be. We'll see. You never know with Bill Belichick, but it's really an interesting situation to monitor.
Yeah, that is one of the tricks with Belichick is, we saw it last year. We've seen it throughout the past. It's frustrating for fantasy purposes. But a lot of times he's looking at matchups like that matchup against the Colts. He wanted to pound the rock on the inside, and he knew he had an advantage there. And early in the season, or whatever that midseason game was when Jonas Gray came on, well, Blunt wasn't on the team at that point, so Jonas Gray made sense. Then in the playoffs, Blunt made sense. And, it's really tough to get that consistency out of the position from New England that we desire as fantasy owners. But Mike, before we do get into, we're going to talk, by the way, I'm alluding, discussion, it's this mystery. Well, we're going to talk some running backs and wide receivers in a minute here, but two quick announcements. First announcement is some of you may remember, if you listened to the show last year in the offseason or the preseason, we decided to live podcast one of our staff mock drafts, and it was completely insane, but somehow managed to turn out to be a really good podcast where you got a lot of insight from more than just Mike and me, a bunch of our staffers. We're going to do the same thing with our first staff mock draft of the season next week. So it'll be a special edition of the Fantasy Slant. Keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. And then also, Mike, the fantasy draft guide is coming. That's sort of the purpose of this this mock draft. And do we have an official release date?
Well, we don't, not yet. We're getting there though. I want to say it's about 85% done. Waiting on some IDP coverage from some guy that's on this podcast. So once we get all that defense IDP content in there, we're good to go. And a little bit of dynasty stuff from Scotty's. He's getting the rankings together. So most of it's done. We have our capsules. We have all of our features in there. We're just wrapping it up. So you should look forward to the draft guide. I'm going to say middle of next week. I'm heading down to Charlotte for Memorial Day weekend. So I think right before that, we're going to release the first edition of the draft guide. If you're signed up for Fantasy Gold, it is free this year. So make sure you get signed up and get ahead of the game there. And if you don't sign up for Gold, it's going to be $4.99 for the PDF, and you can also order the print version on CreateSpace and Amazon. So hopefully that'll be up and running by next weekend. But anyway, I'm excited. We spend a lot of man hours on that in the off season, and it's about to release next week. So stay tuned.
And the IDP will be worth the wait, folks. So yeah, as next week, and the beauty to our draft guide is that not only do we write it, but it's that it's updated, right? Now you can go and you can get a paper copy. I have our last year's copy sitting right next to me. But if you're a subscriber to Fantasy Gold, we update it throughout the offseason. And there's nothing worse, Mike, the old school, we all had this, 10, 15 years ago, we'd go to our drafts, we'd have draft guide magazines there. And we're sitting there in late August, and these things were written in April and early May, and they weren't updated. So you don't have all that updated information. That's the benefit to us. You have access to a PDF file that is updated. You're going to have up to the minute, essentially, not up to the minute, up to the week information, I should say, when you go to your draft with our draft guide, and you get that with Fantasy Gold. You really can't beat it. So exciting times here. And lots to talk about, but Mike, one of the biggest things that we had to do after, because last week we talked all the rookies that we could possibly talk about in the span of 50 minutes. But one of the biggest things that we need to do after the draft is go back, reassess our rankings, figure out what's the impact of the draft, what's the ripple effect, and where does everybody lie. But then there's some other things that we have to debate as well, and I think it's really interesting. We look at quarterback. There's no debate. It's Luck, Rodgers, Luck. Everybody has one or the other in that order, and then it's everybody else from there, and that's fine. But at running back, that's not the situation. We have some people looking at Adrian Peterson, some people looking at Le'Veon Bell, some people looking at Eddie Lacy. I mean, there's write-in votes for Jamal Charles. Some people might even say Arian Foster. Who knows? But I kind of wanted to throw that out there right now and just see where you're standing, your thought process. I'll chip in some of my thoughts here. But on this debate, who is the number one running back for you?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think you could. I think Peterson and Le'Veon Bell stand out. Those are the two I've been really hammering the table for. I think you could probably throw Arian Foster in there too. And I've talked about this before. Everyone's going to say, Foster's definitely going to miss 3 or 4 games. He's always beat up. But, I think you look at the history of injury rates. I don't think you can honestly say Foster's going to miss 3 games, but Forte's not going to miss any, or Forte's going to miss 1, or Marshawn Lynch is only going to miss 1. these guys have similar roles. They're getting older. They're all in that 28 to 30 range. And when I say all, I mean Peterson, Foster, Charles, Lynch, Forte, McCoy, Murray. And that is from the top 11. I think those are the guys that you should be concerned about either workload or age with those guys. So then you say, okay, well, you didn't mention Eddie Lacy in that conversation. You didn't mention Le'Veon Bell. He's suspended, of course, 3 games. That kind of drops him into the category. And Lacy, because of that reason, because exactly what I'm talking about, Lacy is ranked number 1 by a lot of people. We see that in the ESPN rankings that just released that, I helped put together last week. I was adamant against Eddie Lacy as a number 1. I think that he's safe. You're going to get mid-pack running back 1 numbers from him, but he just doesn't have the high ceiling, and that sounds kind of ridiculous in that offense. But just look at last year, as strong as he was for a majority of the season, he finished 6th at the position, and ahead of him was Arian Foster, who missed 3 games, and Lacy missed none. So, I think if you really, work that, if you kind of regress for the injuries, and if you're looking at upside, I don't think Lacy really stands out. Even if Peterson misses a game or 2, or Arian Foster does, when they are playing, they're going to make up for that by essentially winning you week after week because they produce at such a high level. So, there's pluses, there's minuses for all of these guys. But I think what it comes down to is really that per game performance. And I think Peterson, Bell, Foster really stand ahead of the crew. And just really quick to touch on Charles, he was below Lacy last year. So Foster in 13 games outscored Lacy in 16 and Charles in 15.
Yeah, I have these numbers pulled up, and I'm looking at them as you said, and it always stands out to me. Right behind Charles, you have sort of the rest of the pack almost sort of nipping at his heels here. Forsett, Lamar Miller, players like that. So he's not, head and shoulders above the pack that for me would deserve that number 1 overall consideration. I'm still sticking with Le'Veon Bell. I'm holding out hope that possibly this gets reduced, but I mean, not going to hold my breath entirely on that one. But still, like you said, on a per game basis, I prefer, when I'm really close, and I am close with Bell and Peterson in terms of my rankings. When I'm close, I tend to go with the younger player. Yeah, it's not the best situation, but as Mike, you said earlier, when we were mentioning with Brady, it doesn't make sense to do replacement level talent. With Bell, it makes perfect sense. So for me, I like those younger players, especially as we get into later in the season, late November into December. The younger players are the ones who tend to perform better. So I'm leaning that way. I can't fault Peterson, but I'm leaning that direction.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at Le'Veon Bell, and probably what's going good for him, and this is why I can definitely justify him number 1, especially in PPR. I think PPR, and we just saw this in an MFL league that just started. Sigmund Bloom from Football Guys took Bell number 1. That is a PPR format, and I would have as well. And you think about what values you can get at running back right now. Guys who aren't in Bell's tier by any mean, or in that first tier, which I think is 11 deep, but you can get, and I've been getting him as my flex recently, a guy like TJ Yeldon or Tevin Coleman, Jonathan Stewart. These are guys that, at least to start the season, are going to play a significant role and can hold you over for a few weeks and then still give you flex value after that. And they're not, costing you a ton to get their services. And another option, Trey Mason, he's probably going to start the season as a starter, maybe the first 5 weeks if Todd Gurley comes back after their week 6 bye. He's an option there. He's probably going to be a little more expensive than I want to pay for him, but it just shows that you have options, and you can go on and on. Joy Bell's going to have a bigger role earlier than he will later, I think. CJ Spiller and PPR is a borderline top 20 option, I think. So, if the list goes on and on, there are tier 3, tier 4 guys that you can get at a value that makes Bell even more enticing in that first round.
Yeah, and just to piggyback, you mentioned Yeldon. We're seeing news today that Denard Robinson is essentially going to be a kick returner and change of pace back. I mean, so that means Yeldon's going to get the touches. You absolutely have to like that. And Mike, I'll throw some more names into the fire here. When the mock draft that we did, was it probably the 3rd or 4th round, I got Frank Gore. Okay, not a super high ceiling. No, not at all. And he's an older player. But for early season production, you have to like it. And he's a name, too, that you can kind of deploy that strategy. If he gets out to a hot start, which he could potentially very well do so, you could flip him. You could try and trade. And, we're always looking for players to trade with trade value. So that could be a player like that. And then one other player who sticks out to me, and I don't know exactly if you're, how much your league mates, it depends on what league you're in, have caught up to this, but Carlos Hyde, boy, oh boy, if you want to shoot for upside, a younger player who is going to have great opportunity in a run-heavy offense, he'd be a player I'd be looking to target as well, that's outside of that initial top tier. And, Mike, you said, I'm looking through the rankings here, and it just keeps going and going. This is as deep as I can remember running back being.
Yeah, I think I have 11 in that top tier for running back. I also have 11 in my first tier at wide receiver. So, that really gives you options in the first round. I mean, I've seen Mike Evans fall to round 3. I've seen Mark Ingram fall to round 3. Actually, those both happened in the same draft recently. So, I mean, it shows you the depth at the top, and it's allowing some decent players to fall into round 3. It actually, depending on where you're picking, if you're picking towards maybe the mid to I've been pushing like a late first round pick just because you can get a value at running back and then come around and get a star wide receiver. But, maybe picks 4 or 5 overall isn't bad either, because coming around in round 3, it's still possible that a decent player is sitting there for you. You could steal a guy who falls like a Cobb or a Mike Evans, or maybe even Emmanuel Sanders. Not a bad pick there. He's the top of my second wide receiver tier. But I'm with you. I think you can build a great team by thinking ahead a little bit this year. If you get a decent running back, and then maybe you get Ingram or maybe even Carlos Hyde as your number 2, you can still get like a star wide receiver in the middle of round number 2. And then I love Yeldon. I think his ADP is going to go up as people realize he has that 17 to 20 touches nailed down in that offense. And Melvin Gordon, probably the same thing as people become more familiar with him. But at least right now, if you're in MFL 10s or drafting early, there are some very interesting values to be had. And just to quickly touch on Hyde, I think he's very enticing in standard. I think if you get him as your 2 in standard, I love it. In PPR, I'd be a little more worried, especially with Reggie Bush there. And now they have Kendall Hunter's healthy. Of course, they have Mike Davis. So there are some options there on passing downs, and I don't think he's going to get a huge volume there. But in standard, I've been pushing him for a long time. He looks great on tape, and he has that early down role nailed down. I think San Francisco struggles a little bit this year, but I think that Hyde is a candidate for 8 to 10 touchdowns.
Yeah, they're going to struggle for sure. They're going to struggle on the defensive side of the ball. I mean, a lot of people still have that, 4 or 5 year ago version of this defense that went to the Super Bowl, for example. But hey, don't underestimate the impact of Patrick Willis and Chris Borland retiring. That leaves a gaping hole in the middle of that defense. Navarro Bowman coming back from an ACL injury. That was a brutal ACL injury, and it cost him all of last season. Remember, that happened two years ago in the playoffs. This is going to be bad. Justin Smith it looks like he's going to retire. I don't see him coming back, and Eric Armstead is not going to replace Justin Smith. So this team certainly could struggle on the defensive side of the ball, and just as a whole. So it may not be the best year for the 49ers from fantasy purposes. You mentioned Yeldon too, and I love these rookies, man. I love these rookies. And, we saw last year, okay, they want to feed Toby Gerhart the rock. He's getting 300, 350 touches, whatever. Well, that didn't work out, but we do know that that's the mentality of this offense, right? That they do want to run the football in a traditional sense, and that's going to take pressure off of their young quarterback. Remember, this is a young quarterback with young receiving core, really not much of a veteran presence out of any of the receivers. I mean, maybe if you count Julius Thomas as a receiver, tight end, but he's the only real veteran presence there. So running the football can take some pressure off of Blake Bortles. And, Yeldon is really, really, really enticing, especially where he's going at his current ADP. So I do expect that one to rise up or increase, however you want to call it. He's going to be drafted earlier as we go forward. Mike, one other question I have about running back. I want to pick your brain on this one because I'm grappling with this one myself in my rankings. And it's kind of, it's a great situation, but there's just kind of nobody there, and it's Dallas. Okay, what are you doing with McFadden? This whole situation. Do you think McFadden actually emerges as their sort of feature back? And if so, is there any potential there?
Well, I think there definitely is for whoever wins the job. I mean, everyone talks about how good DeMarco Murray was last year. It was more. I like Murray. I think he's very good, but a big part of that was volume. I mean, in terms of efficiency, if you level out the carry numbers, he's right there with the other top guys. It's not like he was far and away more effective than everyone else. It was just the fact that he had 393 carries and caught 57 passes. Keep in mind, he didn't actually catch a touchdown last year, which is a bit surprising when you look at everyone behind him. In fact, the number 2 through 7 running backs each had at least 3 receiving touchdowns. So a little bit bad luck there too. He could have actually done better. But anyway, where I was going with that is Joseph Randle. Everyone, there's debates how good this guy is. Some say he's pedestrian, others say he's just not very good. He led the NFL in yards per carry last year, as the backup. So that offensive line is legit. They added Lyle Collins as well, so they have even more ability at that position. So I think whoever is the starter there is going to benefit. And right now it looks like, I think it's I'm drawing a blank on the ESPN Dallas reporter Todd McClure. I apologize, I butchered his name there, but he says Joseph Randle is definitely the favorite to lead that backfield. That doesn't surprise me. McFadden has not been very good since who knows how long, 3-4 years now. So I think Randle, and I've been back and forth on this. I struggle with it like you do, but I think Randle is the guy to kind of just store on benches right now. McFadden, if you can get him for free late, same thing. But you just got to stash these guys and see how it shakes out. We just don't really know. But if I had to pick one of the group, it would be Randle.
There you go. Right now, I do have McFadden ranked above Randle, but it's close, and it's tough when we don't have any of the preseason information just yet. But of course, as we get into the latter part of the summer here, or the middle of the summer when camps start to open up, we're going to keep our ears to the ground and make sure that we're up to date with the most current information with these guys assessing the landscape. I think Randle makes sense. He's probably more. He's more similar to DeMarco Murray than McFadden is, but stranger things could happen. Wouldn't surprise me if McFadden emerges somehow as the guy, but I don't really have high fantasy expectations for him in Dallas. Mike, real quick, I want to give a word from our sponsors before we get into some talk on the wide receivers. And you would never know it by listening to our show, but there is a sport called baseball, if you've ever heard of it. And it is baseball season, and huge cash prizes are being won every day at DraftKings.com, which is the official daily fantasy sports partner of Major League Baseball. Daily fantasy means no season-long commitments. Season-long commitments in fantasy baseball are probably the worst thing. They're what drove me away from that sport. I really don't play much fantasy baseball at all anymore. But, Mike, I do play fantasy baseball on DraftKings. And you know what's even better, and this is something, Mike, you mentioned where you're going to see a race. Well, there's fantasy NASCAR on DraftKings. There's so many different options that you can play in terms of daily, and it's a new season every single time. You're never stuck with injured players. You never have to work the waiver wire. You don't have to deal with trades. None of it. You just pick in baseball 2 pitchers, 8 positional players, and you stay under that cap, and you can potentially win huge cash prizes. Last season, our buddy Peter Jennings won $1 million playing fantasy baseball at DraftKings.com. Hundreds of thousands of fantasy sports fans just like you have cashed in, so it's your turn. Hurry to DraftKings.com right now and use the promo code PFF to play for free and win part of $300 million being paid out this baseball season. That's crazy money, folks. DraftKings.com, the official partner of Major League Baseball. Use promo code PFF for free entries right now at DraftKings.com. Get yourself a free entry, and that's DraftKings.com. All right, Mike, enough with the commercial. Let's get into some talk on at the wide receiver position. And, again, I don't see necessarily a consensus at the top. And, of course, keep in mind, yeah, it does depend if you're in a standard format, a PPR format. There are going to be subtle shifts there. But again, there's not necessarily a consensus at the top. You have Antonio Brown. I have Antonio Brown, but Pat Thorman, one of our other staffers, has Des Bryant. So, I guess, we're on the same wavelength here, but tell me, for you, why would it be Antonio Brown over somebody like Des Bryant, over somebody like Demaryius Thomas? Or are we really just splitting hairs here?
To an extent, I think Brown is certainly the safest. I mean, he was, I think he, of course, I don't have the stat in front of me right now, but I think he was no worse than I think he was maybe a wide receiver 3 once, and he was a wide receiver 1 or 2 every other time last year. So, I mean, he has the highest floor of any wide receiver. And, he's high volume. He got looks at the goal line. I think he was second in end zone targets last year, or OTD last year. So, as far as I'm concerned, he's both safe and he has the high ceiling. You just can't find high floor, high ceiling guys very often. So that kind of locks him in. Demaryius, I think he'll be okay. Des, I'm probably a pinch lower than everyone else. I mean, everyone pretty much has him as a top 3 or 4 wide receiver. I have him 3, but I think I'm still leaning towards the low end just because he scored 16 touchdowns. No one's ever done that in back-to-back seasons, and that offense was just super efficient last year. They were run heavy. That usually is not a good thing for the wide receivers and the other pass catchers. So, I still think he's right there with Demaryius and Beckham and Calvin, Julio. I think those guys, and I guess you could throw Jordy in there too, kind of stand out the most. But, I think the tier is 11 deep. I mean, even if it's just maybe part B of that first tier is Cobb, Evans, Jeffrey, Green. I think any of those guys could be top 5 finishers this year. It's just it's very close, and that's what makes it okay, if you will, to take a running back in round 1, because you can get one of that, at least one guy from that tier in round 2. And like I said earlier, I've seen Mike Evans fall to, I think it was the 5th pick in round 3. So you could start, let's say you pick 5th, you could get Arian Foster. Then you could come back and get Randall Cobb and then get Mike Evans. I mean, if you can pull that off, that's an absolutely incredible draft, and really just shows you that, it's a little top heavy there at running back with that first tier. It's kind of deep, that first tier, and then you have that big kind of drop off after 20. But at wide receiver, also goes 11 deep at the wide receiver position as well. So those first 2 rounds are going to be really interesting this year.
I think you could definitely pull that off if you're in some of these mock drafts that we've been in.
Yeah, that's true. That I should mention that draft, Jimmy Graham went late in round 1, so somebody isn't paying attention, and we've seen some ridiculous picks. I'll tell you what, if you're doing these mock draft, and here's a PSA. Listen, if you're going to join a mock draft for football, make sure you put your homework in, because some people like us and a lot of other people at other websites, are working hard on football year round. So if you're doing baseball and you're not paying attention, don't join the mock drafts, because you're hurting some of these top sites, out there. And it's not ours. We use our staff who just people who go year round. But some of these other ones, man, I don't know what these people are doing joining these mocks when they're clearly not paying attention. What was the other one? Andre Williams went in round 3. I mean, okay, if you like him and think he's going to be a top 12 running back, you could still get him 2-3 rounds later. You don't have to take him in round 3. It's just ridiculous. So that's my what grinds my gears segment, if you will, for today. I'm not too happy about that.
Well, see, the guy really wanted to take David Wilson, but he couldn't find him. So
yeah, where's Tony Gonzalez going this year? Got to get him in round 5, I think. So, yes, unbelievable.
Sleeper Todd Marinovich. All right, yeah. Todd Marinovich sleeper. Oh man. So but even in a legit league, I'm not saying people falling asleep at the wheel type league. You're right, that could happen, and that's one of the things I preach when it comes to draft season is you want to go into a draft with a plan, but like Mike said, just do your homework. Make sure you know the ins and outs. Make sure you know every last little detail, so that you can respond to the draft itself. Because Mike, you and I, we've been in hundreds, if not thousands, of drafts in our career, whether it's mock drafts or real drafts, etc. Every one of them is different. And you could even do the same mock or same draft with the same people, and it's going to be different the next time. Even if it's a day apart, it's still going to be different. So you have to be able to read and react to the situations. Don't go in, I'm drafting running back in round 1, wide receiver in round 2, running back in round, because you're not going to end up getting value, right? The value, you gotta just, follow the draft itself and react to the draft. And if there are players like that, like Mike Evans falling in the 3rd round, snatch that player up, and that's really how you win your leagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And now Andre Williams and Jimmy Graham are going to live up to those ADPs and make me look stupid. But my point is, you could tell some people aren't paying attention, and that's the problem. We've seen this for years. Every year we do 1 or 2 drafts with kind of random people who are experts or have a website, that kind of thing, and just are out of touch. I mean, it's that simple. There's everybody's a good person and everybody gets along and they're doing their best. But people are looking at football year round. And again, it's not just us at PFF. There's a lot of people who are very much in plugged in and know what they're talking about. And those are the people you should be following. But I'm going to piss somebody off, Jeff. I'm going to stop talking.
Yeah, this is the scandalous edition of the Fantasy Slant here.
This one's going to be on Deadspin, fantasydeadspin.com.
We're going to have TMZ outside our place. Would you like to comment? So no, we're not taking shots really here. It's just a simple matter of, if you're participating in this stuff, know what you're doing. We're professionals, so act professional. And you're going to get that out of us for certain. You're going to get that in the draft guide, absolutely, with our first mock draft coming up and that insanity next week. But it's a pet peeve. It really is. It's a pet peeve. This has been a pet peeve of mine even going before I was in the industry, Mike. I used to do those mock drafts, and you do them on like ESPN or whatever. And you'd have those people who'd come in for the first two picks, and then they just bail, right? And then you're left with this, basically dead team. So it's not a real mock at that point, because they're every time it came to them, they were just taking the top player off of the overall rankings. So it really wasn't beneficial whatsoever. So it's, if you're going to do these mocks, do them, right? Make sure you know what you're doing. Mike, you mentioned these deeper players, not even deeper. Why am I saying deep? Beyond the first 11 wide receivers. And, it's a little bit different than at running back, because you look at running back and, we mentioned some of those players we like. Then, you get into the 20s, it really starts to look iffy, when you're starting to look at guys like, Crowell and even deeper, maybe Sims and guys like that. It's a little dicey. But wide receiver, I don't know if I can say the same thing. I keep looking down further and further on my list, and there's just more and more players that I'd love to scoop up. So I don't know if you're experiencing the same thing. If there's certain players, maybe as you've gone through these mocks, wide receivers that you've been scooping as your 2nd, 3rd, 4th wide receivers consistently.
Yeah, I think so. I think, I mentioned top 11 wide receivers, and then I have from 12 to 19 is another tier. The next one's 20 to 37. So that's, your second half of your wide receiver 2s and 12 teamers, and then all of your wide receiver 3s. And then you even start to get into the bench a little bit, or the flex position. And this is in standard too. So, there's a lot of options in there. I have, for example, to start that tier at 20, Matthews, Cooper, White, a couple of young guys in there, even Sammy Watkins I could throw in there as well. You go to the back end, Allen Robinson, Martavis, Steve Smith, Marcus Colston. Is having Matthews in your lineup over Colston a huge difference? I don't think so. I'm probably, I thought I was low on Matthews, but I think everyone kind of agrees he's kind of a borderline wide receiver too now. But as far as I'm concerned, they're almost the same guy from that far down. So if you're looking at that tier and you're picking a 3rd wide receiver or bench wide receivers, go with upside. I took a little flack today for taking Kevin White, I think in the 6th round or something like that, as my 3rd wide receiver. I'm happy with that. I mean, you look at who he's up against. Amari Cooper again, and I mentioned guys like Marshall, Deshaun Jackson, who is either going to be 50th or 5th when he's playing. Macklin. Who knows how many touchdowns he's going to score? He could score 3 or 5 at, that's 0. Eric, exactly. Eric Decker, Michael Floyd, Andre Johnson, and Larry Fitzgerald are up there in age. Golden Tate we're way down on at PFF for reasons you can read about in the draft guide. Roddy White, Robinson, Martavis Bryant, Steve Smith, Marcus Colston. All them guys I just listed, does White really not stack up with them? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he is maybe a higher ceiling than them. He's in the same position Mike Evans is last year, with maybe a better offense. He has a ton of talent. He was a 7th overall pick. He's a better quarterback than Josh McCown and Jay Cutler, although I guess that's debatable if you look at 2 years ago in that offense. But yeah, I don't know. I think that if you're looking at that tier, you want to go high ceiling. In fact, if you took Kevin White over Julian Edelman right now, I would have no problem with that. I just think, the guy has absurd talent and is in a great spot, a spot where Brandon Marshall has thrived for years, even with the coaching change. So, I'm getting angry a lot today, but there's just one of them days, Jeff. Just one of them days. It's Thursday, not Wednesday this week when we're airing. So maybe that's what it is.
That's it. You're not a Thursday guy. Well, a lot of these people come from that mentality though that, well, rookie wide receivers, no, it's got to be the 3rd year. They're not gonna have 1,000-yard season. Well, look at what we've seen over the last 2 years: Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, Kelvin Benjamin, Keenan Allen. I mean, these are rookies going over 1,000 yards. So it's certainly not outlandish. And the way that this guy plays the game, you're right. It just screams high ceiling. And I would much rather take a high ceiling player. I would much rather White ceiling to Matthews. I mean, yeah, Matthews' floor is going to be higher, but White's ceiling is massive. Would it shock me if we're sitting here in December, at the end of December, and we're looking back and White's a top 12 guy? It wouldn't shock me. I'm not going to predict that, but it would not shock me whatsoever. And to have that as your 3rd receiver, I mean, I absolutely love that.
Yeah, and I've been saying that too. I mean, is Kevin White better than Alshon Jeffrey? Is his long-term outlook better? You can make that case. I mean, it's probably pretty close. If if Vegas was putting odds on Jeffrey versus White to have a better career, it'd be pretty close. I mean, Jeffrey was I think a mid to late second rounder. White was the 7th overall pick. He has a ton of ability. He's obviously younger than out of that group right now. It's not crazy, like you said, to think that White could be ranked ahead of him next year. And and a lot of people are going to say you're just overreacting to last year, all them rookies, but it's a new NFL. I mean, there's more 3-wide sets than ever. It's up by like 20% over the last couple of years. It's more of a passing league. The teams are scoring more than ever. It's just more opportunity for these young wide receivers to make an immediate impact. Back then, when you had a second tight end on the field or a fullback on the field, you didn't have to throw rookies out there. You could put in Chicago, you could put Eddie Royal out there as a decoy and let White on the bench. Now you have Royal on the field and you have another wide receiver out there more often. So you're going to throw Kevin White out there, and he's going to play a lot. He's going to see a lot of targets. So, and just to be clear, the main person I was just discussing this with on Twitter is somebody who is busy in the industry, knows what they're talking about. They just have their own opinion on it. But no big deal. I highly respect anyone who does the work and has their own opinion. They came up with their own. It's not groupthink. I'm perfectly fine with, but I'm just surprised that I'm surprised that it's a surprise that Kevin White is considered a borderline wide receiver too. I think he belongs there and has a high ceiling.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I'm actually the only person on staff right now who has White ahead of Cooper. I mean, I have back-to-back, but I'm trying to make a little bit of a statement just because I do prefer his ceiling. I actually did the same thing, in terms of my dynasty outlook too, my rookie outlook. I have them it's razor thin between the two of them. But for me, that ceiling, it's just massive. Now, no denying, Cooper is silky smooth, polished, but he's in a worse situation offensively. I mean, yeah, he's going to maybe see more of the volume of the targets, but I just love the situation for White. But Mike, going off of what you said there too, yeah, have an opinion, folks. Discuss this stuff with us on Twitter, but because I said so, right? What's the information behind this? Why do you feel this way? I always, always say this in my other job. I always say I'm a college professor in my other job, and I say to my students, you can think, feel, and believe things all you want, but I want to have evidence. I want to know why. And absolutely in a Twitter debate, there's nothing better than Twitter debates. There's no anger behind it. In fact, I think we all grow as a community when we actually do that. So why? Tell me why you feel this way.
Yeah, definitely. And I've seen that in having debates recently. I went through that whole process last week at ESPN arguing, where guys should be ranked. And, you'll have someone say, okay, well, whatever, put Dan Herron and Danny Woodhead like 50th, 55th. And then they say, wait. If they're 50, then they're only going to what a guy that's 50 in that range is going to have 50 carries and catch 20 balls or something like that. But wait a minute, he's a pretty safe bet for 40 to 50 receptions and 80 carries, right? Is that number 2 in that offense? Well, if that's the case, then maybe you should think about bumping that guy up to running back 40 or 35. Especially in PPR formats. You have to, and that's where projections are so important. I mean, are they everything? Absolutely not. I actually, if you look at my projections, I have Kevin White 1 point ahead of Cooper. It's just how the numbers work out. But then you have to consider, where their floors are, where their ceilings are. If there's any injury risk involved, you have to consider those kind of things. Obviously, Le'Veon Bell's projection is going to come in, as maybe running back 12 this year, but he's going to miss 3 games, and that's why it's so low. You have to consider replacement level value, all that stuff, on and on and on. It's a long process. So rankings and projections aren't the same thing. But again, if you think a guy's going to catch 40 footballs at running back, you have to make sure that your rankings reflect that, because he's going to finish in that range, and that's a problem you see with projections throughout the industry, and certainly when it comes to debates on the internet. I think this guy's going to score X amount of points, but finish here. Well, that doesn't even make sense. If he scores 70 points, he's going to finish 12th. Not 24. So it's very interesting. But that's why we're so we lean so heavily on our projections. It really offers an interesting level of explanation for why we have guys where they are. It's very helpful.
Yeah, and we're pulling back the curtain a little bit and showing the process, but how the hot dogs are made here is important, right? Mike and I spend countless hours, emailing back and forth, and Mike probably puts more time into projections than anybody else in the industry. I'd like to think I'm second on the defensive side of the ball, but it's making sure everything aligns, making sure that everything makes sense. We see sometimes projections where teams are slated to go way above the amount of carries they had last year, or whatever it may be, way outside of the statistical range that they should be in. So doing that, and it's just a tool. I know sometimes people will take our projections and they'll think, well, this is the end all be all. And Mike, if I could actually predict with 100% accuracy all of this information, I wouldn't be in this industry, right? I'd be keeping that information to myself and I'd be making tons of money off of it. But we get a good sense of the lay of the land, and we use that as a big part, but still part of all of the information to establish rankings. So, something important to consider there even as just a person who's prepping for their own home league draft, something to keep in mind as you build that draft board.
Yeah, definitely. And it's again, a lot of us can shoot from the hip. We could all sit down, anybody that's tuned in and follows the league year round, we could sit down without any rankings and build a pretty good team. We're going to know most of the players. We're going to, be able to put them in categories, or someone could give us an alphabetical list and we could reorder them and get them pretty close. But if you really dig into the information and project it out, and a good example here is in Cincinnati and Indianapolis. Cincinnati, you look at the running back situation. Jeremy Hill got a ton of work down the stretch. There was a point where they just said, listen, he's our feature back now. Bernard, change the pace, and he'll be out there on passing downs. And if you look at how the touches kind of shaked out, and they did have to run a lot of plays in some of them games. So Bernard, his touches are probably higher than they should be really in a normal situation. But if you really break it down, it's hard to qualify Bernard as an RB2 this year in standard leagues. I mean, he comes in our projections. He comes in, of course, I lost him now here, 34th in standard leagues. That's not very good. You say, okay, it's an extremely run-heavy offense. If something happens to Hill, he has that, running back one ceiling just because he's going to have to play. So you can kind of justify moving him up a little bit. And then in Indianapolis, same kind of thing with Dwayne Allen. He caught 6 of 6 end zone targets last year. He did not get many targets, but because tight end shallow at the end there near the 12 to 14 mark, if you score a lot of touchdowns, you're going to sneak in there. But there's just so many guys with upside that have a much higher ceiling, in my opinion, and aren't going to be as touchdown dependent. Allen comes in 29th in our tight end projection. So this is where numbers have value. You look at when something like that happens, when a guy finished 9th and he shows up 29th, that's where I go back and say, why is this happening? And sometimes we need a tweak. Sometimes it's perfectly justified. And with guys like Bernard and Allen, I've looked at it over and over and over again, because sometimes you feel stupid saying Bernard's a tight end 3, That would be stupid.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. You would feel stupid saying Allen's a tight end 3 or a back end tight end 2. It just sounds crazy, but the numbers completely back it up. It's going to be really hard for him to have another tight end one season, barring a shocking increase in workload, and it's just unlikely in that Indianapolis offense.
Yeah, that makes and that's like probably one of the best examples you can provide there for folks. Like, so when you're comparing, I've gotten questions like this on Twitter. Why are you ranking this guy here, but you're projecting him here, right? And that's why. I mean, is it fair to project him at 20 or to rank him at 29? I don't think that's fair. But where he comes in consensus at 19 for us, and it looks like, Mike, you and I are a little bit lower. I'm at 20. You're at 23 on him, and then our other rankers are a little higher on Allen. But I don't think I could rank him as low as the projections suggest. But I really couldn't put him, in the borderline TE1 range either. So great information there, Mike. We're running long, so I guess we should probably wrap things up. We're about 55 minutes into the show already. We could just talk and talk and talk, and in fact, that's what we're gonna do: talk and talk and talk during the mock draft show. So make sure you're keeping your eyes and ears peeled for that next week. Make sure you're following
Monday.
Mike.
Yeah, Monday at 8. Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern.
If you want to tune in live, live, we'll of course be doing that live on YouTube. Hey, also you can watch our videos on YouTube. You can watch our videos on the Fantasy Sports Network. You can listen to us, subscribe on iTunes, listen to us on Stitcher, listen to us on Blog Talk Radio. There's a lot of different options for you, but just listen in. Hey, comment. If you like what we're doing, let us know about it. Comment on those. Give us stars or thumbs up or whatever the site offers you to do, and we greatly appreciate that. We'll also appreciate you following Mike on Twitter. He is at Mike Clay NFL. I'm at Jeff Ratcliffe. The show, well, you can follow the show at PFF Radio, and of course, follow the main feed at PFF_fantasy, and PFF main is at PFF. So I think that'll do it for all of the announcements.
We need a graphic for all that stuff.
Right? I need an infographic and a flow chart for you to follow through all that. But we'll be back next week. We're going to be back on Monday, and then we'll be back with another show later on in the week. And keep your ears peeled as well for new editions of the Dynasty Slant and the Nickel. So for Pro Football Focus, he's Mike, I'm Jeff, and that's a wrap.